On that evening, when the New York sky seemed tinged with golden hues, she believed her dreams were about to come true. The maid, young and blonde, had prepared every detail with devotion, transforming the simple dinner into a banquet of hope. Hand-picked flowers, candles flickering on the table, and scents mingling in the air like promises of a different destiny. It was the moment she had silently awaited, the instant she believed she would finally be seen, not as a servant of the house, but as the woman she had always hoped to be in her heart. Her eyes shone with anticipation, her soul pulsated in every detail of that romantic setting. But when the door opened, and the millionaire emerged arm in arm with another woman, dressed in fiery red and scented with the perfume of conquest, the maid's world shattered into 1,000 invisible pieces. He entered with firm steps, radiating the confidence that had always accompanied him, while the stranger sat at the table, smiling as if she owned the place. The dinner, prepared with so much love, transformed before the maid's eyes into a stage of humiliation. Each lit candle seemed to mock her naivete, each carefully served dish now a testament to unbearable pain. The millionaire didn't notice the teary eyes that silently followed him, didn't notice the soul breaking behind the apron, and yet, on that night that was supposed to be a night of surrender, fate only planted the first seeds of an inevitable turn of events. Because life never lets injustice go unnoticed. What began as the cruelest rejection would, over time, become karma's most relentless lesson, and no one would escape paying the price. If this story touched you, like, subscribe, and comment. Fate always takes its toll in that elegant neighborhood on the outskirts of New York. The mansion stood as a symbol of wealth and power, but for Emily, the young blonde maid with clear eyes and hidden dreams, that space represented much more than just a job. Every corner, every polished piece of furniture, every prepared meal concealed within it a hope she had never dared confess, that the heart of millionaire Alexander might one day see her beyond her maid's uniform. Emily came from a simple life, marked by absences and struggles, and perhaps that was why her heart found in him, so distant and so untouchable, the illusion of an impossible love. There were no promises, not even words of affection, but the smallest gestures, like a distracted glance or a fleeting smile, fueled a secret desire to be noticed. That day, however, something pulsed differently in her soul. She had woken early, combed her hair more carefully, chosen a tidier uniform, and decided to make dinner something special. It wasn't just a meal. It was her silent way of showing she was there, that she could offer not only her work but also the warmth of her heart. She spent hours in the kitchen, preparing each dish with care, testing seasonings, arranging the cutlery on the table with almost obsessive perfection. In the center, she placed fresh flowers, bought with the little she had left of her salary, a small gesture, but one that carried the weight of her hope. As she lit the candles, Emily mentally rehearsed what the scene would be like when Alexander arrived. Perhaps he would notice her effort, perhaps he would be surprised, perhaps he would even look at her with a different sparkle in his eyes. She imagined the silence broken by simple words, an exchange of smiles, a moment when the distance between master and maid would disappear. Her heart beat faster with every detail, as if she were about to experience a chapter that would change her life forever. But reality doesn't usually respect dreams. When she heard the sound of tires against the gravel of the driveway and the firm footsteps echoing through the hall, Emily adjusted her uniform skirt, took a deep breath, and prepared herself for the moment she had dreamed of. However, when she saw the door open, she didn't find Alexander alone. Beside him walked a stunning woman, draped in a red dress with spaghetti straps and a provocative neckline, the bottom part falling above her knees. Her beauty was dazzling, her expensive perfume filled the room, and her confident smile seemed to say the space already belonged to her. Emily felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Everything she had prepared with so much love was now nothing more than a backdrop for a cruel spectacle she would never be a part of. The flowers, the candles, the carefully arranged dishes became witnesses to her invisibility. Alexander, indifferent to her presence, led her guest to the table, poured the wine with a care he had never shown Emily, and laughed knowingly, as if the entire setting had been prepared just for her. Emily lowered her eyes, hiding the tears that insisted on welling up. She stood her ground, pacing the room as if it were just another night at work, but inside, she felt her heart silently shatter. No words could convey what was happening in her soul. What should have been the beginning of a dream became the mark of her cruelest humiliation. And yet, deep within that pain, a certainty began to form. Fate does not turn a blind eye to injustice. Sooner or later, every tear held back would become a witness to what was to come. Emily remained steadfast, even as every fiber of her being begged her to flee that hall lit by candles she herself had lit. Her hands trembled as she held the tray, and her tear-filled eyes reflected the flickering flame, as if they were two small seas ready to overflow. Her heart, which hours before had been beating with hope, now throbbed like a broken drum, spreading through her body an ache that could not be heard, but burned silently. With each laugh from the woman in red, with each knowing look Alexander gave her, Emily felt herself diminishing, becoming invisible, as if her existence were an inconvenient error in the grand spectacle of which she would never be a part. In the kitchen, where she sought refuge among still warm pots and aromas that once held the promise of happiness, Emily pressed her hands against her chest, trying to contain the pain. Outside, the sound of clinking glasses pierced the walls like daggers, and she wondered how she could bear the torture of witnessing the man she loved silently dedicate tender gestures to another. The dinner she had prepared with such care, which carried a piece of her soul in every detail, now served only as a backdrop for his indifference. But as Emily sank into her own grief, something began to reveal itself, albeit subtly. The guest's gaze wasn't one of love, nor of genuine enchantment. There was calculation in her gestures, interest in every practiced smile, a coldness hidden behind her sparkling beauty. She observed the house too closely, noting every piece of art, every luxurious detail, as if silently cataloguing what might belong to her. Emily realized this the moment the main course was brought in. The woman's eyes weren't fixed solely on Alexander, but roamed the objects in the room with the avidity of someone seeking possessions, not affection. Alexander, blinded by desire and vanity, seemed incapable of perceiving. He laughed loudly, raised glasses, and talked about his business and conquests, unaware that he was revealing more than stories. He was revealing the key to his vulnerability. Emily, silently, understood that that night wasn't just about her personal pain. It was the beginning of a trap that Alexander couldn't see, but that she, from her invisible position, could see with frightening clarity. When the two rose to dance in the ballroom, Emily remained at the door, watching the scene like someone watching a shipwreck without being able to throw a rope. The millionaire led her gallantly, and the woman in red let herself be led with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Emily knew in that moment that what he thought was love was just a cruel game. And this certainty, although it didn't heal her pain, planted within her the strange conviction that life would show her the truth. That early morning, when she could finally clear the dishes, Emily walked like a ghost through the now silent room. The candles had gone out, the wine remained in abandoned glasses, and flower petals adorned the tablecloth like the remnants of a dead hope. Emily took a deep breath, fighting the crushing weight, and slowly climbed the stairs to her simple room. She sat on the bed, took off her shoes, and before she could stop herself, let the tears finally flow. But amidst her tears, one thought repeated in her mind like an inevitable echo. Nothing goes unpunished. Fate makes no mistakes, and sooner or later, what seemed like victory turns into downfall. The next day dawned like any other, but for Emily, nothing seemed the same. The sun filtered through the mansion's heavy curtains, illuminating the hallways with the same majesty as ever. But inside, everything was grey. The memory of the previous night still burned like a hot iron, and every detail of dinner became a wound that reopened with every step. Nevertheless, she followed her routine with the discipline of someone who learned early on to swallow her own pain. She polished the silver, tidied the rooms, and collected the forgotten remains from hidden corners, but in her chest, the hope that sustained her silence had shattered. Alexander, on the other hand, seemed more radiant than ever. His eyes held a vain gleam, as if he had achieved something valuable alongside the woman in the red dress, whose name, everyone soon learned, was Veronica. In the days that followed, his presence became a constant in the mansion. He arrived with expensive perfumes, dresses that captured everyone's attention, and an arrogant confidence that made the staff avert their eyes as they passed. Veronica behaved as if the house already belonged to her, sitting on sofas like a queen on a throne. Walking through the hallways as if surveying her territory, Emily noticed every detail. She saw the way Veronica observed the art objects, the discreet safes, the family-inherited paintings. She noticed the coldness behind the affectionate gestures, the rush to engage Alexander in conversations about investments, travel, and possibilities that always ended with high numbers and vague promises. Alexander, fascinated, saw nothing but a woman who graced his days with attention and carefully calculated compliments. Meals, once prepared with care by Emily alone, became stages for exhibitions. Veronica demanded sophisticated dishes and suggested expensive wines, as if testing the limits of what she could obtain. Alexander gave in without question, proud to satisfy her whims. Emily silently poured each glass and cleared each plate, feeling the knot tighten inside her. Not only out of wounded love, but out of the cruel certainty that she saw before her eyes a man walking toward an abyss. One afternoon, while discreetly tidying her office, Emily found some freshly signed papers on her desk. She didn't dare touch them, but her eyes caught sight of exorbitant numbers, figures she'd never imagined existed, associated with unfamiliar names. As she put the documents away, a shiver ran down her spine. Something was wrong, something beyond common sense but obvious to outsiders. That night, hearing laughter echoing from the main room, Emily passed through the hallway and saw them. Alexander laughing like a delighted boy, and Veronica, glass in hand, watching him, not with tenderness but with triumph. It was in that moment that Emily understood, with the clarity of someone who has known pain, that this woman had not come to love, but to destroy. In the silence of her room, lying on a simple bed, Emily cried again. But this time, the tears weren't just from the pain of her rejection. They were also a premonition. She knew that life doesn't forgive illusions bought with vanity, and that every gesture Alexander made, every signature, every knowing laugh was just another step toward a destiny she couldn't escape, because karma, even if silent, never forgets. The change was first noticeable in the small rituals. Veronica began arriving before sunset, whispering in Alexander's ear, suggesting discreet adjustments, switching the winery's wine to more expensive labels to impress those who matter, firing the long-time driver because he's too loyal to the past, postponing meetings with the lawyer to avoid fueling suspicion. He nodded as if receiving golden advice, and each concession seemed to shift a brick from the foundation that held him upright. Emily, who knew the house's habits like someone who knows their own heartbeat, noticed the deviations. Keys misplaced, side doors ajar in the wee hours, unmarked envelopes resting on the office desk and disappearing before sunrise. One Friday, an invitation to a gala in Manhattan arrived urgently. Veronica wanted to go, insisting it was the perfect stage for Alexander to reappear with a vengeance. He wore the most expensive suit yet to be pawned, and she, in bright red, crossed the hall like a spark in a dark room. Emily stayed behind, watching their reflection in the entryway mirror, and feeling that the beautiful image had cracks that only eyes trained by pain could see. Hours later, when they returned, their laughter still carried the champagne of the evening, but a tension followed. Them like a shadow. In the car, Veronica swore she'd lost a diamond bracelet somewhere during the party, and before dawn broke, she unleashed her first poison. The accusation came sweetly, laced with pity. Perhaps someone in the house had gotten mixed up. Perhaps the bracelet had fallen into the wrong hands. Emily didn't respond. Her tired eyes stared at the floor as Veronica suggested searching rooms and bags, just to be at peace. Alexander hesitated, more out of exhaustion than conviction, and allowed a hasty search conducted by a private security guard, Veronica had kindly recommended. Nothing was found, but shame had already done its work. Emily gathered her things silently, as if gathering up crumbs of dignity, and returned to her work with a calm that hid earthquakes. The next morning the mansion dawned colder than the autumn outside. Alexander avoided her with the indifference of someone unwilling to deal with their own guilt. Veronica, in turn, heaped venomous pleasantries praising Emily's organization, while whispering that trust is everything in a house like this. Small objects disappeared for hours and reappeared later, in unlikely places, as if invisible hands were rearranging reality to tell a convenient story. Emily saw the choreography, sowing doubt, creating tension, isolating the weakest link until everyone believed the guilt resided there. That afternoon, Alexander welcomed two men into his office, old investors, faces from another era. Veronica insisted on remaining, leaning against the back of his chair, dictating the pace of the conversation with light touches and ready-made phrases about agility, unique opportunities, and signatures that can't wait. Emily, with the coffee tray, watched as a thick contract was pushed forward without any pages being read. She also saw the brief discomfort in Alexander's eyes, the moment a question almost arose, and how Veronica killed it with a smile that promised a radiant future. The pen descended. So did fate. Early in the evening, Alexander's brother called from upstate. He mentioned rumors, a strange movement in the accounts, and asked him to review the numbers with his former accountant. Veronica, listening from afar, leaned in and, when the call ended, shed her worry like a wet coat. She said that relatives only show up to erase the shine, and that it was best to break with those who insisted on the past. Alexander, wounded in his pride, agreed. Emily, from the hallway, felt the intimate crack of a bridge collapsing. The last voice that could rescue him had been shut off with a single touch. At the end of the day, the lost bracelet reappeared in the pocket of a coat Veronica swore she hadn't worn. The discovery was accompanied by laughter, jokes, and a mild scolding of the security guard for being overzealous. Alexander, relieved, let the story drop. For Emily, however, nothing had died. Something had been born. The stark certainty that, from then on, any tragedy could be thrust into her lap, and that, if fate didn't intervene, she would be the next piece to be sacrificed. When the house fell silent, Emily went down to the kitchen and stood before the table where, days before, she had arranged flowers and candles. She ran her hand over the wood, felt the invisible map of events beneath her skin, and understood that she would survive the only way she knew how, by seeing what others don't see, remembering what others forget, memorizing. Dates, times, gestures, movements. Not for revenge, but because truth, when it arrives, needs trails, and karma, to do its work, needs someone who won't look away. Outside, New York City shone as if nothing could extinguish it. Inside, however, the lights seemed chosen for a stage for a tragedy to be announced. Emily flipped the last switch, and in the darkness heard the side door open and close quickly. The wall clock read 2:17. She wrote the number down in her memory like someone carving a name in stone. Fate took a deep breath. The fall patient continued its path. The first blow didn't come as an explosion. It came like a crack in a glass, only revealing itself when the water begins to leak. It was Monday morning when the bank manager called Alexander, his tone a mix of old respect and new urgency. There was an inconsistency in the guarantees of a bridging loan he had recently signed, misplaced numbers, transfers at unlikely times, authorizations that seemed his own, but carried the tremor of a hurried hand. Alexander, irritable by nature and anxious by habit, said he would resolve it at lunch. He hung up, looked at Veronica, who smiled with the calm of someone who already had an answer for everything, and suggested that you don't fuel a fire with panic gasoline. Emily in the hallway remembered the time, the words, the silence that followed. At noon, there was no lunch. There was a glass-enclosed room in Midtown, a table gleaming in cold light, and two lawyers, lining up terms like stepping stones. The loan required immediate collateral. The shares Alexander had promised had been pledged in another temporary operation. He swore he hadn't, rummaged through folders, and asked for more time. Veronica intervened sweetly, proposing to move funds from an international account that had always been available. The manager cleared his throat. That account, they said, had already been frozen. That was when Alexander felt the temperature drop, even without air. Conditioning. A door closing, invisible inside his own head. Back at the mansion, Emily noticed his step had lost 2 centimeters of height. It wasn't fatigue, it was weight. As she made coffee, she heard the whispers in the adjoining room. Veronica spoke of possible shortcuts, friends who solve problems, fees that compensate for the rush. She had memorized the precise vocabulary that numbs mistakes. Alexander wanted to believe, needed to believe, and the yes came like a breath. That night, a messenger arrived with documents for an emergency signature. Emily opened the door. The man avoided her eyes. The pen scratched another page. Fate, once again. The next day came the second sign, the one that turns rumor into reality. A longtime supplier cancelled deliveries, citing unpaid invoices despite the receipts Alexander swore he had. The dry email ended with a sentence that seemed handwritten, so personal. "We trust for years, but trust also has a deadline." He slammed his fist on the table and blamed the incompetence of others. Veronica rested her hand on his shoulder and promised a dinner to revive the energy. Emily took a deep breath, stirring the sauce over low heat, and felt that the smell of garlic and butter couldn't mask the burning smell that was beginning to rise from another part of the house, the living room where pride was roasting over high heat. That afternoon, the answering machine received 3 messages from the same number. The third time, the key caller left no name, just a warning. "The signatures don't match. Someone will ask about the night of the 14th. Emily unintentionally committed the date to memory. The 14th, like the day she'd seen Veronica cross the hallway with a heavy bag, 2:17 a.m. on the clock. When hours later she went down to the pantry to restock supplies, she found a receipt lost among boxes of wine. It was from the private garage, a stamp from that early morning, the license plate of a car that belonged to no one. In the house. The scam finally reared its ugly head on Wednesday when the market opened. A margin call rang out like a siren, collateral melted, and the bank automatically foreclosed on securities Alexander would never have risked selling at that price. Within minutes he went from being uncomfortable to being found out. Veronica, who had been modulating her voice to soothe, stood up, picked up the phone, spoke in English with a passing accent, and left to give him some space. Emily saw the trail of perfume and the emptiness left behind when the door slammed. The afternoon was a series of negatives, partners cutting ties, invitations withheld, the feeling that the city learned his name for the wrong reasons. Alexander, who always had someone to blame, stared for a few seconds at his own reflection in the office glass and didn't recognize himself. Emily came in only to leave a pitcher of water. He didn't see her, perhaps because looking at her would be like recognizing the first night, the one when the candlelit dinner was offered to someone else. And memory in those moments isn't an embrace, it's a blade. As night fell, Veronica returned with promises that she already had someone for tomorrow, someone who could unlock everything for a fee that seemed small compared to the abyss. She asked for the safe. Alexander punched in the numbers without thinking. Emily, from the kitchen doorway, watched the metal open like a mouth. Seeing Veronica's hand hovering over documents sealed with the family crest, something inside Emily tightened. Not out of jealousy, not out of possession, but out of a sense of justice as old as the very floor of that house. She didn't speak. She saved it. She wrote it down. She collected the invisible evidence that only the eyes of those who suffered can see. Dates, license plate, folded receipt, the sequence of accidents that weren't accidents. And she understood, without fanfare, that the first blow wasn't the downfall. It was the prologue. The fall would come, and when it did, she needed to find paths. Karma does the work, but it's human hands that sweep the stage. Outside, sirens cut through the Manhattan night. Inside, the clock made a point of marking every second, as if time wanted no one to say they weren't warned later. Emily turned off the hallway lights and before going upstairs, paused at the living room's molding. That same table, once set with flowers and promises, now held contracts that weighed more than any silver plate. She touched the wood with her fingertips, as if sealing a silent pact. When the truth knocks, you'll find the door ajar. With each passing day, the mansion's corridors seemed narrower, as if the walls silently observed the plot unfolding before them. Alexander no longer walked with the puffed-out chest he once had. His steps were heavy, his breathing heavy. The financial losses, which he still tried to minimize with speeches of temporary adjustments, were already becoming apparent even to the most oblivious. The remaining employees whispered, collection letters piled up on the entryway table, and insistent phone calls transformed the silence of the house into a battlefield. Veronica, however, remained serene, as if nothing were wrong with her. While she whispered sweet words in Alexander's ear, she also pressed him with the coldness of someone already calculating their downfall. It's just one more signature, one more transfer, one more investment, she repeated, each time with increasing urgency. Alexander, blinded by wounded vanity and the hope of recovering everything at once, accepted each suggestion as if it were a lifeboat. But Emily saw clearly that they were merely stones tied to the ankles of a man already on the verge of drowning. On a sultry night, a secret meeting was held in the main room. Unknown men in ties arrived in cars with tinted windows. Emily, while serving coffee, observed discreetly. The men's eyes weren't those of partners but of predators. Alexander tried to smile, maintained his poise, but his hands trembled as he signed documents he hadn't even read through. Veronica, sitting beside him, guided the meeting, offering ready-made words and promises that sounded rehearsed. In the end, when everyone left, a bulky contract remained on the table. Emily, silently, realized that something much greater had been handed over, perhaps even Alexander's own future. The following days confirmed his suspicions. One of Alexander's properties, a Manhattan office building, had been hastily foreclosed. Another luxury car disappeared from the garage, taken by officers. The pride that once sustained his name now turned into rumors around the city. Former associates no longer answered calls. Dinner invitations disappeared, and worst of all, the looks on the street became filled with derision. The millionaire was beginning to taste the bitter taste of abandonment. Veronica, however, seemed more radiant with each of his defeats. Her beauty didn't diminish with the crisis. On the contrary, it seemed to blossom amidst the ruins. She spent hours on the phone, speaking in languages Alexander didn't understand, and increasingly disappeared without explaining where she was going. Emily saw everything. Every detail, every shadow, every movement. She felt the trap was closing, and that the end would soon be upon her. One rainy morning, Emily heard hurried footsteps in the hallway again. She peeked through the crack in the door and saw Veronica descending the stairs, her heavy bag swinging at her side. Minutes later, the sound of a car pulling away cut through the silence of the night. Emily closed her eyes and remembered the receipt she'd saved, the license plate number she'd written down, the date etched in her memory. It all made sense now. Veronica wasn't just destroying Alexander from the inside, she was also stealing tangible pieces of his fortune with every furtive exit. When day broke, Alexander received news that would seal another wound. One of his main accounts had been emptied. The bank had confirmed transfers made at times he didn't even remember being awake. Alexander, distraught, threw papers on the floor, screamed, and blamed everyone around him. Veronica, in a soft voice, simply said, "This is temporary. Trust me." He believed her because he had nothing else to believe. Emily, silent, simply watched. She knew that fate had already written the final line of that story. All that remained was to wait for the moment when the castle would finally collapse. Karma, patient and relentless, had already cast its dice. And now, each move only hastened the inevitable. The following weeks were a long, windowless corridor. The phone rang with voices that confused demand with cordiality, and emails arrived in small bursts that pushed Alexander back another step. His name, once spoken with pride in Manhattan salons, now trickled down in whispers in the elevators, accompanied by half-lights and half-truths. One morning, when trying to enter a club where he had a reserved table, the doorman looked away and said there was unforeseen maintenance. Through the glass door, Alexander saw occupied tables, laughter, glasses raised in toasts that had once been his. He returned to the street as if putting on a coat that no longer belongs to him. At home, the dust seemed to gather faster than Emily could gather it. It wasn't a lack of zeal, it was time turning to mud. Paintings were auctioned off. A piano that had gleamed in the living room was dragged away by busy men, and the echo that remained in its place sounded like the most sincere note the mansion had ever produced. Alexander's steps lost their rhythm. Sometimes he would go down to the kitchen in the middle of the afternoon and stand watching the kettle boil, as if waiting for the metal to teach him the art of endurance. Veronica remained a presence that came and went like the tide. When she was there, she filled the rooms with perfumes, laughter, and promises to sort it all out tomorrow. When she wasn't, there were coded messages, cold bills, and a silence that felt like being robbed without hands touching. Emily noticed she spoke less to Alexander and more to the shadow of the phone itself, and that each absence returned with a missing detail: an inherited watch, a ring missing from a drawer, a misplaced safe file. Alexander saw but didn't see. Pride is a bandage that sometimes prevents the wound from healing. The city, relentless, delivered its verdict on a rainy afternoon. As he walked through the lobby of an office building, Alexander passed two former business associates. One hurried along as if he were late, the other lifted a newspaper as if searching for urgent news. Neither of them had any appointments. They were afraid of mirrors. The security guard at the reception desk, who once rushed to help him with his coat, simply said, "Good afternoon," in a tone too neutral to hurt. Alexander felt the weight of his own surname as he searched for a chair and found nothing. That night, Emily found him sitting on the stairs between the first and second flights, as if the precise height of the step were the only point in the world capable of supporting a collapsing man. She stopped a few steps away without intruding and remained there, breathing with him, silent. Alexander didn't ask for anything. He simply said, without the courage to look up, that maybe all of this is fair. The sentence fell in the air like a confession. Emily thought of the candles she lit at their first dinner, of Veronica's laughter across the marble, of the late nights she wrote down license plates and times. She thought, finally, of how justice, when it arrives, isn't content with being correct. It wants to be pedagogical. The creditors lined up. The lawyer called to say the office building was no longer negotiable, that the liens had been foreclosed, and that the accounts would need to be opened like wounds to clean them. Alexander nodded, even though the man was on the other end of the line. When he hung up, he stared at his hands for a moment, the same ones that signed contracts without reading, that opened safes without thinking, that offered cups to those who only wanted to collect them empty. Emily passed by, leaving a glass of water and a bowl of soup. He thanked her, almost in a whisper, and drank as if relearning a primary gesture. One early morning, he found the courage to go out alone. He wandered aimlessly down wet avenues, saw shop windows reflecting versions of himself he didn't recognize, listened to the dignified and cruel city do what it always does: move on. He stopped in front of a flower stall, stubbornly open, and bought a small bunch of cheap daisies. He returned to the mansion with them in his hands, unsure why. Entering the kitchen, he found Emily finishing putting away the dishes. He placed the flowers on the counter, not as an offering but as an apology, a clumsy attempt to ask the world for respect, starting with the one person who had never asked him for anything. Emily didn't smile. She simply poured a glass of water and placed the bunch inside, as if accepting a truth without needing to comment. The next day, the social coup took shape. An article by a columnist who had already drunk expensive wines at Alexander's expense outlined his trajectory in 3 paragraphs. Meteoric rise. Questionable. Choice's inevitable fall. The word inevitable throbbed in her temple until nightfall. Emily watched the report out of the corner of her eye, washing her hands with more force than the grime required. There was no satisfaction in watching it all. There was only the realization that karma finally had a timetable and an address. When the house fell asleep, Veronica reappeared like a flash. She brought a new plan, foreign names, a final bridge to cross the river. She urged haste, demanded trust, and above all asked for the key to a secondary safe, the one that held not only papers but memories, letters from his father, a photo of his mother, a clock that marked family time before money. Alexander hesitated for a second that could have been a lifetime. Emily from the hallway held her breath, and then he extended his hand, surrendering to the fear of losing what was already lost. It was in this surrender that loneliness came full circle, because there is no greater abandonment than betraying one's own memory. Emily leaned her head against the wall and let the silence speak for her. The city slept. The house pretended to sleep. Fate, in turn, woke up a little more. Soon the noise wouldn't come from doors slamming, but from truths being placed exactly where they'd always been. The morning the collapse became public didn't bring thunder or cinematic rain. It was ironically clear New York skies that accompanied the first headlines. Printed newspapers plastered Alexander's name alongside words like fraud, collapse, and investigation. Business websites published cold reports revealing suspicious transactions, hastily made deals, and funds evaporating in offshore accounts. On social media, his name became synonymous with downfall, and each share was a stone thrown against the pedestal from which he had fallen. In the mansion, the phone rang non-stop. They weren't friends, they weren't business partners, they weren't invitations. They were journalists, creditors, lawyers, voices that pressured, exacted, and fed on the ruin. Alexander, once proud and haughty, walked down the hall like a man carrying invisible shackles. With each call, his breath became shallower, his eyes deeper. And Veronica? She was serene as always, only more distant. She didn't get angry, didn't defend herself, didn't explain herself. She simply listened, smiled with practiced calm, and sometimes talked about going out to resolve contacts that no one ever saw. It was that week that his social circle finally abandoned him for good. A charity dinner Alexander had helped fund in previous years took place without his name on the list of patrons. Former allies looked away, columnists treated it as a scandal, and even the most senior employees began calling for his permanent dismissal. Emily watched silently, but deep down she felt the scene wasn't just humiliation, it was justice. Life, finally, was giving the millionaire back the weight of every choice. And it made a point of exposing his vulnerability to the world. Veronica's mask, however, began to crack. Seeing that Alexander no longer had invitations, no more open doors, no more liquid wealth to flaunt, her gestures lost patience. There were no longer long kisses or calculated compliments. Only demands remained. We need more resources. We have to sell what's left. We can't waste time on feelings. Her voice, once sweet, now held the metallic tone of impatience. Alexander still tried to believe her, clinging to her with his last shred of dignity. But Emily saw clearly. There was no longer even pretense. It was during a nearly silent dinner that the truth emerged. Sitting at the table, with Emily serving simple, understated dishes, Veronica slammed down her glass and said, "You're nothing but a broken man. I won't go down with you." The sentence cut the air like a knife. Alexander stood still, speechless. Emily, her hands steady on the tray, looked away, respecting the silence that was both a wound and a sentence. That night, Veronica gathered her things, stuffed jewelry and documents into her bag, and left without looking back. The door slammed shut with a loud bang that echoed throughout the mansion, like the final nail in the coffin of a life built on vanity. What remained was a lonely man, surrounded by shadows of furniture about to be auctioned off, by walls that held bitter memories, and by a maid who, even injured, still remained. Emily didn't rejoice, didn't celebrate. She simply walked the halls, picking up the pieces of his life, knowing that karma never fails, and that her every tear, every humiliation swallowed in silence, now became a witness to the collapse. In the city, the news spread like wildfire. Alexander was no longer a millionaire, no longer trusted, no longer respected. But inside the mansion, the truth had another face. That of a man finally naked before himself, with no fortune to hide, no companion to deceive. And Emily silently knew this was just the beginning. When the auctioneer's truck pulled up in front of the mansion, the street was quieter than usual, as if even the neighbors were afraid to make a noise in front of a body lying there. Alexander watched through the window as a fluorescent sticker was being placed on one of the boxes. Inventory. The word, cruel in its coldness, seemed to stamp not only the objects, but his own history. The lobby smelled of polished wood and abandonment. The antique clock continued to tick, insistent, as if refusing to accept the idea that time, too, can fail. As he descended the stairs, he found Emily in the hall, carefully folding 2 sheets that would be collected at the end of the day. A simple, almost liturgical gesture. Alexander wanted to say something, but his tongue refused to cooperate. He walked past her and into the library. He stood for a few minutes with his hands in his pockets, staring at the empty shelves where books had been hastily removed, leaving shadows of dust like frames of what had once been worthwhile. On the table, he found a photograph that had escaped the inventory. His father with his shirt rolled up, his mother laughing at a picnic in the countryside. The image smelled like before. He sat, rested his forehead on his hands, and remained there motionless, while the noise of the truck seemed to come and go from his chest. In the kitchen, the echo of unused pots betrayed the new routine. Emily lit the stove, boiled water, and chopped garlic. The scent, once a promise, was now a care. When she placed the bowl before him, it wasn't a gesture of pity. It was a silent surrender of humanity. Alexander ate in silence, the steam blurring his gaze for a few seconds as he avoided hers. When he finished, he managed a complete sentence. "I messed up." Emily didn't fill the void with answers, just picked up the bowl and let the faucet run. The sound of the water was the only mercy available at that moment. The next few hours passed amid boxes, papers, and voices on the phone that mingled haste with disdain. The lawyer spoke of deadlines, the bank spoke of limits, a former partner spoke of lessons. Alexander listened to it all with his head bowed, as if accepting that the rain has no argument. Mid-afternoon he went upstairs to his room, opened the secondary safe, and removed a metal box that wouldn't interest auctioneers. Old letters, the worn ribbon of an inherited watch, a note in his mother's shaky handwriting. "Don't forget to say thank you." He sat on the edge of the bed and read the letters for so long that the sun shone through the carpet without him noticing. As dusk fell, the power flickered. The light flickered twice, like tired eyes, and then went out. Emily struck a match, then another, and the house became a charcoal sketch. She placed candles throughout the kitchen and hallway, restoring the place to a kind of dignity that doesn't depend on electrical outlets. Alexander appeared, in the doorway, disheveled, and asked if she intended to leave when it was all over. Emily was silent for a second, as if weighing her words in the palm of her hand, and then replied with an unpracticed serenity, "I finish what I start." He nodded, not daring to turn his relief into a smile. Later, when the movers finished their work and the street began to breathe again, Alexander came down with a garbage bag in his hands. He didn't delegate. He tied it, carried it, and returned. He washed his bowl, owned dishes, missed the cutlery drawer, and got it right on the second try. Small things that night weighed like a shift in the axis. Emily complained about a loose hinge on the cabinet door. He fetched a screwdriver, tightened the screw, and tested it twice. The sharp click as it closed, a ridiculously common sound, was the most honest knock of the day. Some part of what had been loose was falling back into place. In Emily's simple room, the window let in the distant murmur of the city. She sat on the edge of the bed, took off her shoes, and for a moment allowed herself to remember that first night, the candles, the flowers, the red dress, the humiliation. She touched her eyes with her fingertips and, instead of an open wound, found a scar. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was memory deciding to hurt less. Alexander, for his part, remained in the empty office with the candlelight reflecting on the windows. He took out a notebook and wrote down dates, names, places. For the first time, not to protect himself but to tell the truth, if only to himself. He noted the early morning of the heavy bag, the license plate of the strange car, the signatures he didn't remember making, the times that didn't match his diaries. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and realized his breath had returned to his chest. Acknowledging he understood is the first installment of any debt. Before going to bed, she left a hastily written, crooked note on the kitchen counter. "Thank you for staying when everyone else leaves." Emily found the paper that morning, folded it and tucked it into her apron pocket, as if guarding a valid document. The doorbell rang. On the other side, there were no guests, no journalists, no creditors. Just an envelope stamped with the word that turns shame into procedure: hearing. The date was accompanied by a list of documents and the indication that new evidence had been attached. Emily and Alexander exchanged a brief glance. Neither fear nor euphoria, just the silent pact of those who know that the truth, when it arrives, demands a set table. Loneliness, then, stopped being a desert and became a waiting room. And, deep down, beneath the dust, something breathed. It wasn't hope for miracles. It was the bitter beginnings of dignity. In the days leading up to the hearing, Alexander discovered that the city had a short memory for triumphs and a long one for failures. In cafes, where he had once received warm greetings, he now heard the scraping of chairs and the awkward silence of those who preferred to avoid his presence. At a restaurant where he usually reserved tables months in advance, he was informed that there were no seats available. Through the windows he saw empty seats. It was as if New York had decided to wipe him off the map, but not before making him witness his own erasure. The headlines continued to drip venom. They called him reckless, naive, too arrogant to listen to advice. The tone varied, but the essence was always the same. He was guilty of being deceived, and that in that society was a greater sin than stealing. In the circles of power, no one wanted to be associated with his name. And each closed door was a cruel reminder that wealth had never meant true respect, only convenience. Veronica was no longer seen. Her disappearance sparked rumors, and some columnists suggested she might have fled with compromising documents. For Alexander, this silence weighed more heavily than any headline. He wandered the empty mansion like a ghost, sometimes sitting on the stairs, sometimes motionless in the deserted library, as if waiting for the walls to restore the version of himself he had lost. Emily, however, remained present. Her tasks, which no longer included banquets or polishing silverware, were reduced to small gestures that sustained life: a hot meal, clean clothes, a mopped floor. It wasn't an obligation, it was a decision. And this silent presence became the last shred of humanity Alexander could touch. Sometimes he would observe her in silence, with a mixture of regret and gratitude, but without the courage to confess anything. Emily, for her part, required no words. Her presence already said more than any speech. The city, however, would not allow him to go through this process in silence. One morning, as he was leaving to try to settle his bank debts, he was surprised by a small crowd in front of the branch. Reporters surrounded him, microphones shoved in his face, cameras flashing like lightning. The questions were cruel. How does it feel to lose everything? Do you still believe in Veronica's love? Will you admit your guilt in court? He didn't answer. He simply lowered his head and walked through the crowd like a condemned man walking to the gallows. The images spread across television and social media, further heightening the feeling that his downfall was not just financial, but public, irreversible, almost a spectacle. That night, sitting before a candle in the kitchen, Alexander murmured, "Everyone wants to see me fall, but no one asks how I got here." Emily, who was washing the dishes, paused for a second. She looked at him but didn't answer. Because the truth is, life always asks questions. Only few have the courage to listen. 2 days later, the final summons for the hearing arrived. An official envelope, delivered by an agent who seemed to carry the shadow of fate itself. Inside, the clear warning: new evidence had been attached, and testimony would be decisive in determining his responsibility. Emily was in the room when he opened the envelope. Their eyes met, and for the first time, There was no arrogance or desperation in him, just a man naked before his own truth. And it was in that silence, amidst scattered papers and the distant crack of thunder beginning to herald a storm, that Emily understood. The city could turn its back, his friends could abandon him, but the ultimate justice didn't come from the newspapers or the courts. It came from Karma, which was already walking down the hallway and preparing to knock on the door. The nights following the summons were the longest Alexander had ever known. There were no more parties, no more voices in the hallways, no more clinking glasses or revving luxury car engines in the garage. All that remained was the echo of his own footsteps and the pent-up breathing of a house that seemed to watch him with resentment. The mansion, once a symbol of his greatness, was now a labyrinth of shadows. The cold marble reflected a version of him he didn't recognize. Disheveled clothes, sunken eyes, slumped shoulders. The once celebrated man had become a broken figure, and loneliness had become his daily sentence. It was in this setting that Emily proved even more indispensable. With her simple, almost invisible gestures, she maintained what dignity remained. She prepared modest meals, kept the kitchen warm, and swept the hallways even when there was no more furniture to clean. Her presence was discreet but constant, like a silent thread that kept Alexander from sinking completely. He began to notice what he had previously ignored, the way she smoothed her hair with her work-stained hands, the way her eyes remained steady even after so many humiliations, and the serenity she exuded even when the world seemed to be collapsing. One morning, unable to sleep, Alexander went down to the kitchen. He found Emily lighting a candle, as the power had been cut in part of the house. The flame illuminated her face, revealing lines of fatigue, but also a soft, regal beauty that no jewel could buy. He stood in the doorway, watching her silently, as if seeing her for the first time. Emily looked up and was struck by the vulnerability etched on his face. "Can't sleep?" she asked quietly. He simply shook his head and sat down at the table. She placed before him a mug of simple tea, brewed with herbs she had been saving since the beginning of winter. Alexander drank in silence, and in that banal gesture, he found more comfort than in all the banquets he had ever attended. Over the next few days, small changes began to emerge. Alexander, who had always treated Emily like a piece of furniture, began to notice her presence. One afternoon he helped her carry a heavy box to the storage room, something unthinkable months before. Another time he ventured to make coffee alone and laughed at himself when he realized he'd burned the water. Emily laughed not in derision but in lightness, and that laughter was like an open window in the midst of the suffocation. He began to speak more softly, to listen more, and even the way he walked around the house seemed less arrogant. Even so, the pain didn't fade. With every call from lawyers, with every news story about his downfall, Alexander remembered the man he'd been, vain, insensitive, blind to what truly mattered. At night, sitting in the empty library, he'd gaze at the spaces where paintings and trophies once stood, and understand that none of that remained. But when he heard Emily's footsteps echoing down the hallway, he felt there was still an anchor keeping him from being swallowed by his own ruin. One night, while arranging the simple flowers Emily had left on the table, Alexander murmured, "I never realized what was truly before me." Emily, who was washing the dishes, heard but didn't respond. She knew those words weren't a confession directed at her, but a belated acknowledgement of all she had lost by ignoring simplicity, loyalty, and the true value of things. Even so, that moment marked a shift. Alexander, for the first time, wasn't talking about business, fortune, or regaining what had been lost. He was talking about what truly remained, humanity. And it was in this shared silence between washed dishes and a candle lit in the kitchen that something began to germinate. It wasn't full redemption. It wasn't immediate forgiveness, but a seed, a possibility that even amidst the ruins, something could still be born that fate couldn't destroy. The morning brought a chill that seemed to have come from within the house. Alexander woke before the sun and stared for a while at the window, where the city moved on indifferent to any private tragedy. In the hallway, the stacked boxes reminded him that almost everything was gone. What remained were small sounds. Emily's kettle, the mop on the counter, the discreet creak of wood giving in to. Winter. When the mailman rang the bell, the manila envelope weighed like lead in his hand. Date, time, room, judge. The hearing was no longer a distant idea and had taken on a body, a face, and a clock. He said nothing. He placed the paper on the table and ran his fingers along the corners, as if searching for a way out drawn on cardboard. Emily read the silence, poured coffee, and, before leaving, asked if he wanted sugar. He shook his head and, in an almost childish gesture, rested both hands on the mug, as if he needed the warmth to relearn how to exist. Throughout the morning he tried calling 2 lawyers. One didn't answer. The other suggested a solid narrative and documents that connect dates to movements. Alexander hung up and stared at the floor, where the sun outlined a pale rectangle. Emily left without warning, crossed the storage room, and opened a metal box she'd kept since the first major cleaning. Forgotten receipts, visitor tags, small garage receipts stamped early. In the morning. There were the exact times the side door had opened, nights that coincided with Veronica's heavy bag, license plates that belonged to no one in the house. She returned to the kitchen, spread the papers on the table like someone lining up ingredients, and calmly said, "This might help." He looked up slowly and for the first time didn't try to save face. He simply thanked her. That afternoon, they boarded a subway together that smelled of metal and hurried people. The city didn't ask for names. In the lawyer's office, the mirrored glass returned versions of themselves that seemed simpler and therefore more truthful. The man listened without interrupting, asked for the dates, drew a map of arrows on a yellow pad, and offered a glimmer of hope. If they showed a pattern of coercion, of repeated manipulation, the blame might at least shift. They left in silence. On the way back, Alexander bought a small bunch of cheap flowers from a stall. He didn't say who they were for. He left them on the sink when they arrived and watched Emily improvise a vase with a scratched glass. The gesture lit in the kitchen like a candle that needed no matches. The power went out at nightfall. Emily struck matches, distributed small flames throughout the hallways, and for a moment the house seemed to breathe again. Alexander awkwardly offered help. He fetched water, washed dishes, missed the cutlery drawer, and got it right on the second try. The sound of water in the sink became a sound of rain inside. When the kitchen was clean, he took a deep breath and said without embellishment, "I owe you an apology. I don't know how to ask." Emily didn't fill the void. He let the words settle, like dishes dripping down a grate. The phone rang around 10. The lawyer. New evidence had been formally attached by creditors, also investigating Veronica. The records Emily had brought matched footage from parking lot cameras and transfers made at unlikely times. "Tomorrow will be tough, but it won't be blind," said the voice on the other end. Alexander nodded, staring into space, and when he hung up, his shoulders slumped a centimeter, not in defeat, but as if finally accepting the right weight. The wind blew through the crack in the window and blew out a candle. Before the darkness could fill the room, there was a knock on the door. 2 short rings. Emily and Alexander exchanged glances, and it was he who walked down the hallway first. On the other side, an agent with a sealed envelope and a woman in a trench coat, her credentials dangling like a small beacon. The investigator spoke quietly, without pretense. There were warrants issued in neighboring states, cross-referencing of data, a formal request for Emily's testimony as a routine witness, an observer of schedules, movements, and accesses. "We need to hear what you saw without anyone asking you to see it," she said, looking at her. Emily nodded, not out of bravery, but out of respect for the truth she had guarded, like someone guarding water in a desert. When they closed the door, the house fell quiet again. Alexander returned to the kitchen and touched the rim of the glass that served as a vase, as if that could teach him not to break what is simple. Emily blew out the candles one by one, leaving only one lit on the table. The flame flickered, drawing on the bare walls a dinner that was no longer humiliation, but a prelude to justice. The dawn, finally, didn't seem like an enemy. It seemed like a hallway, leading to a place with chairs, white light, and full names. There were no guarantees of victory. There was what had always been missing, truth with a date and time, and that, for fate, is often enough to tighten the world's first screw. The morning of the hearing dawned with a grey, heavy sky, as if New York had decided to follow the fate that would unfold in that courtroom. Alexander wore an old suit, worn at the shoulders but clean. No tailor could rebuild his shattered image, but at least he still had the dignity to present himself in one piece. Emily walked beside him discreetly, a briefcase clutched tightly to her chest. There was no jewelry, no makeup, no luxury. There was only the silent firmness of someone who carries the truth within. The courtroom was packed. Reporters crowded the hallways, cameras captured every movement. Curious onlookers jostled for a closer look at the man who had once been synonymous with power and was now a model of downfall. Entering the room, Alexander felt the stares like blades against his skin. The judge, grave, opened the session and read the records, each word hammering at his conscience. Fraud, collusion, suspicious movements, co-authorship. Alexander's heart pounded, but for the first time he didn't seek escape. He sought confrontation. It was then that Emily was called to testify. The young woman walked to the podium with firm steps, her eyes never leaving her. Many had seen her as nothing more than a servant, invisible, for years, but now she was the one holding the keys to truth. The researcher present in the room greeted her with a slight nod, and Emily began to speak. Her words were unadorned, but they carried the weight of simple things. She recounted dates and times, described the heavy bag coming down the stairs at 2 in the morning, mentioned the garage receipt with an unknown license plate, mentioned the times documents disappeared and reappeared, and how Veronica moved around the house as if she already owned it. Every detail Emily revealed matched bank evidence, camera footage, and testimony from other employees in parallel investigations. Little by little, the plot unfolded before everyone's eyes. Alexander was not innocent. He had sinned through vanity and blindness, but he had been manipulated, used, and discarded. Veronica, for her part, emerged in the trial not as a companion, but as the architect of a network of fraud spanning 3 states. The judge, impassive, took notes. The defense attorney highlighted the pattern of manipulation. Reporters typed frantically, chronicling the spectacle of truth. When the session ended, the decision was read in a grave voice. Alexander would officially lose part of his assets, would also be held accountable for negligence in some contracts, but would not be charged with intentional fraud. The harshest sentence, however, fell on Veronica, who now had an outstanding arrest warrant and whose name was spread across the newspapers as a synonym for fraud. The city, which had previously judged only sarcastically, now murmured about the dangers of ambition and the fragility of power. Alexander left the courtroom without applause, but also without the shackles he feared. The sun, shyly, broke through the clouds and touched his tired face. Beside him, Emily walked in silence, and for the first time, he saw her not as a servant, but as someone fate had placed there to remind him of what truly matters. Back in the nearly empty mansion, Alexander entered the kitchen where the glass containing the cheap flowers he had bought days before still remained. He sat at the table, took a deep breath, and murmured, "I lost everything that didn't matter, and only what was left was what should never have been forgotten." Emily, who was washing a pot, didn't respond immediately. She simply let the water run, then dried her hands and sat across from him. There were no declarations, no promises. There was only presence. That night, the house was lit by candles, not the candles from the dinner of humiliation, which had once witnessed his pain, but new flames, small, simple, symbolizing a new beginning. Dinner was no banquet. It was shared soup, broken bread, and comfortable silence. Alexander looked up and found in Emily not the forbidden passion that fate had denied him in the past, but the pure truth of someone who remained when everyone else was gone. Outside, the city hurried on, indifferent. But within those walls, a symbolic turning point had taken place. The millionaire who had humiliated, lost, and fallen now learned firsthand that karma never fails. He had been stripped of everything superfluous only to discover at last that the only true wealth had been before him all along, silently lighting candles when the darkness seemed invincible. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel and comment. Fate always takes its toll.